Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
Pulpit Commentary, Exodus chapter 24, verses 1 through 8, the ratification of the covenant. The giving of the book of the covenant being now completed, Moses, having received directions with respect to another ascent into the mount, verses 1 and 2, descended to the people, and in the first instance declared to them the main heads of the covenant, which they received with favor, and expressed their willingness to obey, verse 3. Not, however, regarding this as a sufficiently formal ratification, the prophet proceeded to write out in a book the whole of the commands which he had received. He then built an altar, erected 12 pillars, offered sacrifice, and having collected half the blood of the victims in basins, summoned the people to an assembly. At this, he read over solemnly all the words of the book to them, and received their solemn adherence to it, verse 7, whereupon, to complete the ceremony, and mark their entrance into covenant, he sprinkled the blood from the basins on the 12 tribes, represented by their leaders, and declared the acceptance complete, verse 8. The ceremony was probably modeled on some customary proceedings, whereby important contracts between man and man were ratified among the Hebrews and Syrians. Verses 1 and 2. It has been supposed that these verses are out of place, and suggested to remove them to the end of verse 8. But no change is necessary. It is quite natural that God should have given the directions before Moses descended from the mount, and that he should have deferred executing them until the people had accepted the covenant. Nadab and Abihu were the two eldest of Aaron's sons, and so his natural successors in the priesthood. Had they not sinned by offering strange fire, Leviticus chapter 10 verses 1 and 2. They had been mentioned previously in Exodus chapter 6 verse 23. 70 of the elders. On the elders of Israel, see Exodus chapter 3 verse 16 and Exodus chapter 18 verse 21. The 70 elders may, together with Nadab and Abihu, have represented the 12 tribes, 6 from each. Worship ye afar off. Though all were to ascend the mount to a certain height, only Moses was to go to the top. The others, being less holy than Moses, had to worship at a distance. Verse 3, and Moses came. Moses descended from the mount, and reported to the people all the words of the Lord, all the legislation contained in the last 3 chapters and a half, Exodus chapter 20 verse 19, to Exodus chapter 23 verse 33. Not perhaps in extenso, but as to its main provisions. And all the people answered with one voice, promising obedience. In times of excitement, a common impulse constantly animates an entire multitude, and an exaltation of feeling leads them to make pledges, which they are very unwilling to stand by afterwards. Hence Moses requires something more than a verbal assent. Verse 4. Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. We may presume that they were miraculously brought to his remembrance by that Spirit of truth, which guided all the prophets. 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 21, John chapter 14 verse 26. Having written the words, he waited till the next day, and then rose up early, and builded an altar, in preparation for the sacrifice without which no covenant was regarded as binding, and 12 pillars, symbolical of the 12 tribes. Compare Joshua chapter 4 verses 3, 9, and 20. Verse 5, and he sent young men. The Levitical priesthood not being as yet instituted, either all the people were regarded as holy, and so anyone might offer sacrifice. Or the young men selected may have been of the number of the firstborn, who were priests in their respective families until the appointment of Aaron, and his sons to be priests of the nation. Exodus chapter 28 verse 1. No doubt young men were selected as most competent to deal with struggling animals. Verse 6, Moses took half of the blood. The blood, which symbolized the life of the victim, was the essential part of every sacrifice, and was usually poured over the altar, or at any rate sprinkled upon it, as the very crowning act of offering. See Leviticus chapter 1 verse 5, Leviticus chapter 3 verse 8, etc. On this occasion Moses retained half of the blood, and put it in basins, for the purpose of so uniting all the people in the sacrifice, and thereby the more solemnly pledging them to the covenant, which the sacrifice at once consecrated and consummated. See Hebrews chapter 9 verses 18, 19, and 20. The other half of the blood was, according to the usual practice, sprinkled upon the altar. Verse 7, and he took the book of the covenant. In this book we have the germ of the Holy Scriptures, the first book actually mentioned as written in the narrative of the Bible. Genesis may contain other older documents inserted by Moses, under the sanction of the Holy Spirit, in his compilation. But his own composition, if we accept the burst of poesy called forth by the passage of the read. See Exodus chapter 15 verse 1 through 18. Would seem to have commenced with the book of the covenant. Upon this nucleus the rest of the law was based, and it was to explain and enforce the law that Moses composed the Pentateuch. In the audience of the people, literally, in the ears of the people, which is equally intelligible and more graphic. And they said, etc. The people made the same answer as before. Verse 3. Adding a general promise of obedience to all that God might command in future. Verse 8, Moses then proceeded to the final act. He took the blood from the basins, and sprinkled it not certainly upon all the people, who numbered above 2 millions, but upon their leaders and representatives, the elders, and other chief men, drawn up at the head of each tribe, and thus brought within his reach. It has been supposed by some that he merely sprinkled the blood on the 12 pillars, as representing the 12 tribes, but had this been the case, the expression in the text would probably have been different. We read, in the epistle to the Hebrews, that he sprinkled both the book and all the people. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 19. As he sprinkled, he said, Behold the blood of the covenant, etc. It was a common practice among the nations of antiquity to seal covenants with blood. Sometimes the blood was that of a victim, and the two parties to the covenant prayed that, if they broke it, his fate might be theirs. Sometimes it was the blood of the two parties themselves, who each drank of the other's blood, and thereby contracted a blood relationship, which would have made their breaking the covenant more unpardonable. Moses seems to have followed neither practice at all closely, but, adopting simply the principle that a covenant required to be sealed with blood, to have arranged the details as he thought best, by the sprinkling of both the altar and the people. The two parties to the covenant were made partakers of one and the same blood, and so brought into a sort of sacramental union. Verses 9 through 11. The sacrificial feast and the vision of God. After the covenant had been ratified by the unanimous voice of the people, Moses proceeded to carry out the injunctions with respect to Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the elders, which he had received while still in the mount. See the comment on verses 1 and 2. Taking them with him, he ascended Sinai once more to a certain height, but clearly not to the summit, which he alone was privileged to visit. Verses 2 and 12. The object of the ascent was twofold. 1. A sacrificial meal always followed upon a sacrifice, and the elders might naturally desire to partake of it as near the divine presence as should be permitted them. This was their purpose in ascending. 2. God desired to impress them with a sense of His awful majesty and beauty, and was prepared for this end to manifest Himself to them in some strange and wonderful way as they were engaged in the solemn meal. Verse 11. This was His purpose in inviting their presence. The manifestation is described in verse 10. It was a vision of God, but of what exact nature it is impossible to say. Having recorded it, the author parenthetically notes that the divine vision did not destroy any of those who beheld it, or cause them any injury, as might have been expected. Verse 9. Then went up. Compare verse 1. The mountain was to be partially ascended, but not to any great height. Nadab, Abihu, and the elders were to worship God afar off. Verse 10, they saw the God of Israel. These words can scarcely mean less than that they saw with their bodily eyes some appearance of the divine being who had summoned them to His presence for the purpose. Moses, we know, saw a similitude of God. Numbers chapter 12 verse 8. Isaiah saw the Lord sitting upon His throne. Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1. Ezekiel saw upon the throne the appearance of a man. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 26. It does not follow from Deuteronomy chapter 4 verses 12 and 15 that the elders saw no similitude, since in that passage Moses is speaking not to the elders, but to the people, and referring not to what occurred at the sacrificial feast after the ratification of the covenant, but to the scene at the giving of the 10 Commandments previously. Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. What the form was which the elders saw, we are not told. But as it had feet, it was probably a human form. It may have been hazy, indefinite, too dazzling bright for mortal eye to rest upon. But it was a true vision of God and, as Keel says, a foretaste of the blessedness of the sight of God in eternity. There was under His feet, as it were, a paved work of a sapphire stone. Rather, and under His feet was, as it were, a work of clear sapphire. Nothing is said concerning a pavement, but only that below the feet of the figure which they saw was something which looked as if it were made of bright blue sapphire stone, something as clear and as blue as the blue of heaven. Canon Cook supposes the actual sky to be meant, but the expression, as it were, the body of heaven, or like the very heaven, makes this impossible. A thing is not like itself. Verse 11. The nobles, i.e., the notables, the 70 elders, and other persons, already mentioned. Verses 1 and 9. He laid not His hand. God did not smite them with death, or pestilence, or even blindness. It was thought to be impossible to see God and live. See above, Genesis chapter 32 verse 30, Exodus chapter 32 verse 20, Judges chapter 6 verses 22 and 23, etc. Man was unworthy to draw near to God in any way, and to look on Him was viewed as a kind of profanity. Yet sometimes He chose to show Himself, in vision or otherwise, to His people. And then, as there could be no guilt on their part, there was no punishment on His. It is generally supposed that, in all such cases, it was the second person of the blessed Trinity who condescended to show Himself. Also they saw God. Rather, they both saw God, and did eat and drink. The two were simultaneous. As they were engaged in the sacrificial meal, God revealed himself to them. Verses 12 through 18. Moses' entry into the cloud, and 40 days commune with God. It was necessary now that Moses should receive full directions for the external worship of God, the sanctuary, and the priesthood. Every religion has something tangible and material about it: holy places, holy things, rites, ceremonies, rules, forms, regulations. If man sets himself to devise these things of his own head, he may very easily go wrong and find his elaborate inventions an offense to God. To avoid this, to secure the result that all should be pleasing and acceptable to the high and holy one which inhabiteth eternity, he then went up the mountain, accompanied for part of the way by Joshua, who is now spoken of as his minister, or attended. Verse 13. Joshua probably remained with him for 6 days, while Moses waited for a summons to enter the cloud. On the 7th day the summons came, and Moses, leaving Joshua, entered the cloud, and was hid from the sight of all men. Verse 12. Come up to me. Moses, apparently, had descended again into the plain with Aaron and the 70 elders after the festival was over. See verse 14, and compare Exodus chapter 32 verse 1. He is now commanded to reascend and be their eye, and continue there, foreshadowing the length of the stay, tables of stone, and a law, and commandments, etc. Literally, tables of stone, and the law and the commandments which I have written. The three expressions alike refer to the Decalogue, which alone God wrote, that thou mayest teach them. Rather, to teach them. God wrote the commandments on stone, in order to inculcate them with a greater force upon his people. Verse 13. Moses went up. Prompt to obey, Moses, though he had only just descended from the mount, immediately made ready to set forth, and again ascended. This time he was attended by his minister Joshua, whose arm he had employed on a former occasion against the Amalekites. Exodus chapter 17 verses 9 through 13. The name Joshua is, however, still given him by anticipation, since he did not receive it until he was sent by Moses to explore the land of Canaan. Numbers chapter 13 verses 8 and 16. Verse 14, and he said unto the elders, before taking his departure for the long sojourn implied in God's address to him, come up to me into the mount, and be there. Verse 12. Moses thought it necessary to give certain directions to the elders as to what they should do in his absence. 1. They were to remain where they were, i.e., in the plain at the foot of Sinai, until his return, however long it should be delayed. 2. They were to regard Aaron and Hur as their leaders, and as Moses' representatives. In case of any difficulty arising, they were to refer the matter to them. On Hur, see the comment upon Exodus chapter 17 verse 12. Verse 15. Moses went up into the mount, having made the necessary arrangements for the government of the people during his absence. Moses ascended in company with Joshua to the upper part of the mountain, and there waited for some further summons. A cloud, or rather, the cloud previously mentioned, Exodus chapter 19 verse 16, stood gathered upon the highest eminence, and marked the special presence of God there. Moses, though called up into the mount, would not intrude into this inner sanctuary until specially bidden to enter it. Verse 16. Now occurred a remarkable pause. The summons had been given to Moses, and he had obeyed it. He was there on the platform a little below the summit, ready, but waiting for a further call. The call was not made for 6 days. A holy calm reigned upon Sinai. The cloud rested upon the summit, and in the cloud was the glory of the Lord. Moses and Joshua waited near, but for 6 days there was no sign. God thus taught Moses, and through him the world, that near approach to him requires long and careful preparation. Moses, no doubt, was occupied during the 6 days in continual prayer. At last, on the 7th day, the call, which Moses had expected, came. God called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. God summoned him to a closer approach, bade him enter the cloud, and draw as nigh to him as possible. Verse 17. Meanwhile, to those below in the plain, the glory of the Lord on the summit above them was like devouring fire on the top of the mount. They had but to lift their eyes thither, and they saw his wonderful glory showing like a huge fire on the spot from which he had spoken to them. Exodus chapter 20 verse 18. This manifestation continued certainly for the first 6 days. Whether it lasted longer or not is open to question. Verse 18. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud. Quitting Joshua, Moses at last, in obedience to the call out of the midst of the cloud, entered within its shadow and disappeared from human vision in this abnormal condition. Alone with God, he continued for 34 days, making, together with the 6 days before he entered the cloud, the 40 days and 40 nights of the text before us. It is noted in Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 9 that during the whole of this time he was without food. Compare Elijah's fast, 1 Kings chapter 19 verse 8, and our blessed Lord's Matthew chapter 3 verse 2.